Lars found himself sitting in the throne room on the Isle of Leso, where he was summoned, along with all but one of his siblings. While Hans remained in the stables, King George Westergaard had summoned the rest of his children to a meeting. Lars was sitting away along the cold stone wall to the right of the throne, his eyes glued to the floor as his mind wandered, thinking about the situation that his little brother was in. At that point, Lars had done his best to drown out the conversation that was being held among his brothers who, like him, were wondering why their father wanted to speak with them. Among the voices, Caleb's was the most prominent among the company of his brothers. Not only was Caleb the eldest out of the princes, but he was also the proudest of the bunch. He rarely kept anything to himself, especially when it came to his opinion. Meanwhile, the other siblings were all chattering among themselves. Lars couldn't help but overhear Rudy and Runo discussing their plans to mess with Hans while he was sleeping later. He shook his head as he tried to drown out all of the yelling that surrounded him. Silence fell over the room as the king lifted his hand from the throne. Lars and his brother ceased all conversation and turned their attention to their father. They all bowed as they made eye contact. "I think we all know what we're here to discuss," King George said, as he slowly lowered his hand back to the armrest of his throne. "The kingdom of Arendelle and the mess caused by that boy. What could we have been thinking sending Hans?" he asked rhetorically and began to scan the room, looking over the faces of each of his sons. While the rest of his siblings smiled, smirked, or even chuckled at the fact that their father thought that Hans was useless, Lars was the only one who maintained a straight face. "I'm not entirely sure Caleb would have done any better," he thought to himself. The king cleared his throat. "So, what are we going to do about Arendelle? There is little doubt that tensions are high between the kingdoms after your brother's failure, and for all we know, they could be preparing to seek action in some way." He paused for a moment before finishing his thought. "And now that we know what our new queen can do with her mysterious abilities, how are we ever going to take that kingdom and its ports?" "Take?" Lars thought to himself as he drew his head back in confusion. "He still thinks we can take Arendelle? We should feel lucky that they haven't taken any aggressive action already." Lars' train of thought was interrupted as Caleb stepped forward. "Let me take it, sir, with your army at my command. There is no way that the Southern Isles can lose." He stepped forward to continue speaking when he was cut off by his father. "Why do you sound excited about this, Caleb? Do you realize that situation that your fool brother has put us in?" the king said, gradually raising his volume. Caleb's head dropped so that he was staring at the floor. "Of course, my lord, it's just—" He looked back up to the throne and met eyes with his father. "Think about it, sir. The kingdom is weak." "Weak!" yelled the king. "Arendelle is ruled by a witch with power that can freeze an entire port, and you think they are weak?" No, sir," Caleb replied. "But Elsa is a new queen, and she is just that, a queen. A queen cannot rule a kingdom, certainly not by herself." Caleb could feel his confidence coming back. His voice became less shaky, and he was now staring the king right in the eyes. He began to approach the throne. "Even the strongest of kingdoms are weakened when power is transferred from one person to another." Lars shook his head and began to tune out his older brother. "I wonder how Hans is holding up out there," he thought to himself as he looked toward the door. "My king, let me bring you this victory," Caleb nearly yelled. "We need to act while the kingdom is unorganized and before they have had time to confer among other kingdoms that they might align themselves with." From the sound of his siblings muttering behind him, it would seem as though Caleb had the support of his brothers, though if he had been looking, he would have noticed that Lars wasn't too involved in the matter at hand. The twins, Rudy and Runo, were particularly boisterous about their support for their eldest brother. Rudy stepped forward to stand next to Caleb. "I'll go with the men, and with our Caleb at the helm, there is no way we can lose, and there's no telling what kind of mischief can be had in Arendelle." Runo chuckled as he stepped up alongside the growing line of siblings. King George looked beyond the three to see how the other 9 of his sons were reacting to Caleb's speech. Maybe I can convince them to let me handle his punishment, Lars thought to himself. Maybe if I offer to watch him and monitor him at all times, he might at least get to sleep indoors. The king noticed that Lars had been looking down to his feet for quite some time and was beginning to wonder if he was paying any attention to the meeting at all. Or maybe I could convince them that he might try to run and that I should keep a close eye on him inside of the castle where he can't go anywhere. Lars scoffed to himself quietly, not knowing that everyone's attention had turned to him. They'd never let him off that easy. "Lars!" the king yelled to get his son's attention. Lars shook his head and looked up to the throne only to be matched by a scowl from his father that sent chills through his bones. King George smiled. "Now that I have your attention, what do you think we should do about Arendelle and their Ice Queen?" Lars took a moment. He glanced around him at his brothers, who were all eagerly awaiting his answer. He could tell that all of them wanted to say that they should go to war, but Lars knew better than that. He stood from the stone bench that he had been sitting at and began to walk forward. He brought his left arm up to rub his neck as he gave thought to the next words that would come out of his mouth. Caleb, Runo, and Rudy all smirked as Lars walked past them, hoping to see their wise brother make a fool out of himself. "Well, sir," Lars cleared his throat, "I think it might be wise to take a less aggressive approach." He could hear the sound of groans of disagreement behind him. "We have already tried an unprovoked usurpation of the kingdom and it failed. And as it stands, Arendelle would have every right to attack us, and odds are their allies would back them up on the front line." Lars looked up to see his father, to see how he was reacting, but he didn't have any luck. Staring at the king was like looking at a brick wall. The only time Lars could tell what he was feeling was when he was in a rage. He began to pace back and forth as he rambled on, hoping to come up with a plan as he spoke. Wouldn't it be wise to try to mend what was broken? That way, at least the Isles wouldn't have to live in fear of an attack. Lars stopped pacing when he heard a response from one of his brothers. "Mend what was broken? What are you talking about, Lars?" asked Caleb. Lars turned and responded to his older brother. "We invite Queen Elsa to a banquet here." "A banquet?" asked Rudy and Runo in unison. "Yes, a banquet." Lars turned his attention back to the throne. "Sir, we invite Queen Elsa and a few of her advisors to the Isle of Leso, and when they get here, we apologize." "Apologize?" Caleb responded, thinking that Lars' idea was outrageous. "My lord," Lars knelt down as if to appeal to his father's ego. "If we can get the queen here and she receives an apology from both you as our king and Hans as her offender, it might make things a lot easier for everybody. We can follow it up with a feast the likes of which only the people in these halls have ever seen." As Lars' siblings continued to mock his plan, he kept his attention on his father. He knew that the only person in that room whose opinion truly mattered was the king's. King Westergaard took a moment before responding to his well-spoken son, but after raising his hand up and bringing silence down upon the room again, he asked Lars, "What makes your solution any better for our kingdom than your brother's?" Lars rose from his knee and looked back towards his siblings as he tried to come up with an adequate response. Caleb smirked at him as if he knew that Lars was caught off guard. Lars shook his head and turned back to his father. "My king, if we are to go to war, even if we should come out victorious, and let's face it, that's a big if." He looked back to Caleb to make sure that his smile had faded. "Queen Elsa has the entire army of Arendelle at her disposal. Even if we manage to catch them off guard, you are almost guaranteeing the death of countless men. Not to mention these unknown powers that we've been told about." Lars walked a bit closer to the throne and held his head high in a display of confidence toward his family and in his response. "At best, we know very little about what this new queen is capable of, and even less about how far she is willing to go to keep her people safe. Is that really worth the risk right now?" Lars maintained steady eye contact with his father. "Not to mention how much it will help us to appeal to other outside nations." A puzzled look fell over the king's face, and before he could ask his son what he meant, Lars answered him. Almost every other kingdom who has ever done dealing with our people has given us a reputation that is, he paused for a second, let's just say less than honorable. But if we owned up to the mistakes made by one of your children and showed everyone that we could be dealt with peacefully, we might see more borders opening up to us. Lars once again began to kneel, only this time he was stopped by his father before he could complete the action. King George Westergaard lifted his hand for the third time, and he stood from his throne. I've heard all that I need to hear about this matter. The eyes of all 12 of his sons were on him, each of them awaiting the king's choice. For what he was to say next would be the final decision as to what to do with Arendelle. He must know that the right answer here is peace. He has to, Lars thought to himself, though he knew he was the only one in the room who felt that way. As always, you are the wise one, Lars, the king said, bringing shock to all 12 of the princes. But sir, Caleb began to say before being silenced by his father's stare. Lars is right. What better way to take Arendelle than to make it seem like we want peace? King George began to grin as he noticed the confused look on all his children's faces. We will send word to the queen, inviting her to the banquet, as Lars put it. Then we shall send a ship to pick up her and her guests so that she isn't required to expend any resources. When she is here, we can show her what we have done with the boy and then treat her to a fine meal. Caleb went to say something but was cut off by his father, who was still speaking. We will then offer to her and her kingdom our deepest apologies along with a splendor of gifts before sending her back home. The king took a step forward. However, what she will not be aware of is the fact that we will be sneaking the boy onto her ship to go back to Arendelle with her. But sir, why would we sneak Hans back into the kingdom? Caleb asked, to which the king laughed. Because with him on the inside, we can begin to learn all of the secrets that will help us bring Arendelle and its people to their knees. And if Hans should be caught, they will think it was all his idea and that he acted alone. Lars finished his father's thought. Exactly. It's a great plan, my son. The king nodded to Lars before calling for a scribe. Lars couldn't help but rub the back of his neck. He was baffled. This isn't what I had in mind at all, he thought to himself. You may leave me now. I will have my men keep you all informed as to how this will proceed, the king said. He then gestured to Lars. Not you. You come here for a moment. The rest of Lars' siblings left the throne room as Lars approached his father. I'm going to need you to make sure this all goes according to plan this time, he said to his son. What do you mean? Responded Lars. You're going with Hans to Arendelle. I'm putting you in charge of making sure that he doesn't screw this up any more than he already has. Lars began to look at the floor. Why me, he thought. You can let the boy know our plan when you sneak him out his dinner later. Lars looked up at his father, who was simply staring down at him. You may go now, and make sure that scribe gets in here fast. I have an invitation that needs to be written. Lars slowly made his way out of the throne room and through the castle. He made sure to grab a plate of food for Hans before going out to the stables to inform him of their new punishment.